Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Tristan Rickert, and this is Postmodern. My goal for this episode is to create the context, to set the stage, so to speak, for the other episodes. We will be discussing the historical roots of postmodernism, how exactly postmodernism came to be, and also identifying its themes and tracing those through history as well. My guest for this episode is Dr. Isaac Choi. He is a professor at George Fox University. As an undergraduate at Harvard College, Dr. Choi studied physics and chemistry, focusing on quantum chemistry and biological chemistry, but he was also fascinated by the philosophical and theological questions raised by contemporary science. He received 2 masters from Princeton Theological Seminary in philosophy and theology, writing a thesis on divine action, quantum mechanics, and computer simulations. Dr. Choi's doctoral dissertation in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame was on the nature and epistemology of expertise, centered on the question of how we should decide between disagreeing experts. He also has research interests in philosophy of religion and analytic theology, including petitionary prayer, the metaphysics and epistemology of divine action, the cosmological fine-tuning argument for the existence of God, theological and philosophical anthropology, and the epistemic significance of tradition and majority opinion in theology. Dr. Choi held a postdoctoral research fellowship in philosophy at the University of Oxford, and before joining the George Fox faculty in 2018, he was a visiting fellow in the Rivendell Institute at Yale University. Writing and speaking on philosophy of religion and science, and Christian spirituality and spiritual formation. Today, he is the interim head of the honors program at George Fox. Now, on to the interview. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Tristan Rickert, and I'm here with Isaac Choi. How are you?
Great.
Awesome. So our goal for this episode is to trace the historical roots and themes of postmodernism from where they began and to where we are today. So my first question, and I've kept this consistent with the other guests, is what is postmodernism?
Postmodernism. Well, postmodernism has lots of different definitions, but I think the one that kind of is the common theme that at least I identify as central to all these different versions or definitions of postmodernism is the idea that there is no such thing as objective truth, right? This idea that, and when we talk about objective truths, we're talking about truths that are true whether or not people believe them or whether or not even people exist at all, right? Normally we think of things like, Jupiter is a planet that orbits the sun. Like that's an objective truth that would be true no matter what, whether or not humans believe that or whether or not humans even existed. That's the idea of objective truth. But postmodernism kind of turns things on its head and says, no, actually, there is no such thing as objective truth. That truth is something that we construct as human beings, that as a society, we kind of make things true in a kind of subjective kind of sense and not in any kind of objective kind of thing. And I think that that's kind of at the core of what postmodernism is claiming.
So what are the other major themes of postmodernism?
Right, and so a lot of these other kind of major claims or themes of postmodernism come out of that. It flows out of that rejection of objective truth. So, for example, Jacques Derrida, who was a major literary theorist in the 20th century and a huge central kind of figure within postmodern thought, he argued that in literary interpretation, right, when we see a text, he thought that there was no objective meaning to that text, right, that anyone's interpretation is equally valid as anyone else's, right? So that the text or the book or the essay or something like that could be molded in any way that you want it from a purely subjective perspective. And there was no kind of like, it didn't matter what the author intended or what the author wanted to say, because that was just another subjective interpretation of the text that could be kind of brought to bear. And so I think that is one of the huge areas. So you apply this in so many other areas in terms of literary criticism, literary theory and interpretation, even to things like biblical interpretation, right? Where postmodern biblical interpretation would say, well, there actually is no objective meaning to this particular passage in Scripture. Any interpretation from any perspective or any hermeneutical approach is perfectly legitimate. And this really goes against traditional views of interpretation of Scripture, as well as interpretations of any text or any novel or any book at all. So that's one theme. Another theme, kind of in a different kind of direction, would be kind of the rejection of objective truth in ethics and morality, right? This idea that traditionally people believe that there were these objective truths about what is right and wrong, what's the just thing to do, whereas what's the unjust thing to do. Whereas postmodern ethics would say, no, there is no objective truth out there with regard to what is right or wrong. We make things right or true based on our personal beliefs, that kind of thing, right? So so sometimes, one version of this kind of postmodern view of ethics is something called ethical emotivism, in which the analysis of ethical claims, ethical truth statements, is actually boils down to kind of expressions of emotion, right? Sometimes it's called the boo hooray theory of ethics, in which it's like, if you say slavery is wrong or racism is wrong, all you're really saying is, it's not that there's some objective truth about slavery or racism, but that, boo racism, right? Or boo slavery, that kind of thing. It's just a purely kind of emotive expression of your own individual preferences and nothing beyond that, right? That kind of idea. And so that would be kind of postmodern ethical approach, right? And I'll give you just a third example, right? So there was something called the Strong Program in the sociology of science, in which these theorists, they basically said science itself is not really about objective truths, right? I mean, obviously, most scientists actually do think of themselves as like, okay, we're investigating the real world. We're trying to get to objective truth about reality and physics or biology or whatever, right? But this what's called the Strong Program in the sociology of science claimed, no. There is no objective truth there. We are just constructing these kind of theories and claims and laws in the scientific realm, but there's nothing beyond our kind of making those things up, that we're agreeing as the scientific community or as individuals that these things are true about the world, but there's nothing kind of objectively true about these kinds of claims, right? So you can kind of see this common theme throughout literature, throughout ethics, throughout analyses of science, even analyses of theology and biblical studies, that kind of central core idea that there is no objective truth and that we construct truth is something that is kind of, it bears this kind of fruit in all these different kinds of areas.
So let's start talking about it, or let's start talking about this chronologically. So when did these ideas begin?
Right. So, I mean, strictly speaking, if we're talking about postmodernism itself, it's pretty much a 20th century phenomenon, especially this kind of second half of the 20th century. But there's so many other kind of historical antecedents to this. And so maybe we can go way back into time and then kind of go forward from that point to see like where these threads were picked up, right? So, philosophy, at least in the Western world, was started in ancient Greece, right? We're thinking about the times a couple centuries before the birth of Christ. About 4 or 5 centuries before Jesus was born was this time in which these Greek philosophers were really first struggling with these questions of truth and reality, like what is the nature of the world, this kind of thing. And there was a group of philosophers there called the Sophists, and one of the most prominent one of those philosophers was this fellow named Protagoras. And Protagoras, he had this famous catchphrase in which he said, "Man is the measure of all things," right? So like this idea that human beings are the things that confer meaning and truth to reality, right? That traditionally we look out into the world and we kind of try to get a sense of what reality is. But Protagoras kind of flips that around and says, no, we're the ones who kind of dictate what reality is. And so he was one of the first, what philosophers call relativists, right? That truth is not this kind of objective thing that reflects reality that's out there, but that, that truth can differ based on who is making that judgment, right? It's based on each individual person's kind of thing. And so his was a very important kind of, one of the first earliest versions of this kind of a proto-postmodernism. Obviously, this is kind of anachronistic, right? But that kind of idea. But for the vast majority of history since that time, that relativism wasn't this major force, because other philosophers came around like Plato and Aristotle, who really very strongly kind of pushed back against Protagoras and the other sophists and said, no, there is an objective truth, right, that we can come to know. Sometimes it's hard to know, but it's something that we can come to know. And that view about reality, that there is this objective truth and that we can come to know it, is something that Christianity, when it came along, kind of picked up and adopted, right? Because a lot of the early Christian theologians were trained in Platonic philosophy, right? And so they said, oh, this agrees with what the scriptures say in terms of like, there is this truth that's grounded in reality, and we can come to know it. Obviously, the Christians had a slightly different take, right? That truth comes through revelation, comes through Christ, all these kind of things. But they agreed with the Platonists and the Aristotelians that there is this objective truth that we can know, right? So with the kind of, so probably for about, let's say, almost 2,000 years, this kind of view of there is objective truth, and we might disagree about that objective truth, like, Christian theologians would disagree with each other, or against like Muslim theologians or Jewish theologians or philosophers. But they still all agreed that, things were not relative. Like there wasn't objective truth. And, maybe, a Christian might think the Muslim is wrong, or the Muslim might think the Christian's wrong, but that there is a truth to be known, right? Now things started becoming a little bit more confusing with actually the Reformation and the scientific revolution. Right? I think that this is kind of like what began to start breaking down this huge, stable foundation of this belief in objective truth. And the reason why is this, like, Martin Luther and the Reformation, he started seriously questioning the kind of medieval Catholic theological consensus, right? And it wasn't just this one guy out there who disagreed with him. A lot of people started agreeing with him. And because of this, kind of Christendom in Europe kind of split between Protestants and Catholics. And so anyone there might start wondering, okay, wait, what is the truth here? Like, can we really know the truth, right? And so this kind of raised these questions like, who's right here? Is there even a right here, right? And then at the same time with the scientific revolution, with Copernicus and Galileo, remember, like, in medieval and even ancient history, everyone thought that the sun went around the earth, right? But with Copernicus and Galileo, they actually argued, no, it's actually the other way around. Contrary to what seems like, the sun rising and the sun setting, that actually there's this kind of, there's this completely opposite view that the earth actually goes around the sun. So in a way, it's like, you can't even trust your eyes, right? That what you see as reality is actually reality. And I think that this really led to both the kind of Protestant Reformation as well as the scientific revolution really kind of led to this kind of deepening skepticism, right? In the sense of like, how can we know the truth? When even the things that seem most obvious to us, whether it be in the realm of religion or in the realm of science, are not obvious. Like, in fact, it's kind of the opposite of what we might normally think, right? And I think that really led to this deep questioning of whether we can know reality, right? And so, kind of the history of, and this kind of started what we call the modern age, right? And so when we talk about postmodernism, it's kind of like what comes after modernism. And modernism is where what I've just talked about in terms of like these theological questions, these scientific questions. And this caused many philosophers in the modern age to start wondering, okay, how can we know truth, right? So this question of epistemology. Epistemology is the sub-area of philosophy of theory of knowledge. How can we know, like, what is knowledge? And that, all those kinds of questions, right? And so, lots of philosophers wrestled with this question, like, how can we know truth, when sometimes it seems that, like, even our best efforts at getting to know truth, like for example, does the sun go around the earth or the earth go around the sun, is something that's really difficult to know, right? So I think that that's something that really kind of was a deep kind of existential kind of like, how do we go forward? Should we be Protestant? Should we be Catholic? Should we even maybe be atheists, right? And so many of these modern thinkers started turning to reason. They said, okay, if we only can use reason, like reason, don't look at all these other, ancient philosophies, don't look at, these ancient scriptures or theological tradition, like let's look at these things purely by reason alone. And reason alone, there's this kind of great hope that reason alone can like actually give us the truth about reality, about ethics, about, religion, all these other things, right? And so that was the kind of move that was made. But it's interesting that even within modernism, there were these kinds of almost like self-destructive tendencies, right? Because two of the biggest thinkers in modernism were the Scottish philosopher David Hume, living in the 1700s, and then a German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who was living also in the 1700s, just slightly later than Hume. And Hume had this kind of, he really valued reason, he really valued like sense experience and perception and evidence and all these kind of things. But then he started claiming, hey, look, there's lots of things that we assume about reality that there's no way we can know that these things are true. Things like, cause and effect, right? And we see like one billiard ball coming and hitting another billiard ball, but we don't actually see the cause and effect relationship. We just see one thing happening after another. And so he really kind of raises these kind of skeptical worries. Like, do we really know what we think we know, right? And then Immanuel Kant comes along and says, actually, having read his Hume, he's like, he says that it woke him up from his dogmatic slumbers, that now he's actually really worried about what we can know about reality, right? And so even at the heights of the kind of modern period of this kind of really optimistic view of what reason can do, both Hume and Kant really started kind of raising these deep questions of what reason can actually accomplish, right? And so in the following century, in the 1800s, then you have people who start to be really openly kind of doubting the power of reason. So for example, Karl Marx, right? The founder of communism, right? He started saying, look, when people claim truth, when people claim, oh, this is the result of reason, that's actually, kind of a tool for class warfare, right? Like it's like the powerful and the wealthy, they're using that to kind of control the masses, right? And so it's kind of basically taking that idea that the philosophers thought, okay, we can get to truth using reason, kind of, and turning it around and saying, actually, reason or claims of reason and truth are just a tool to try to manipulate people. They don't really have anything to do with reality, right? And then another thinker in the 1800s, Friedrich Nietzsche, would come around and say, God is dead. We can't believe in God anymore. But God used to be the foundations of how we can know anything about value and meaning and truth about the objective world. And I think that Nietzsche is kind of like this pivotal figure. He died in 1900, right? So he died right at the turn of that century. And I think that his kind of views on the inability for us to have objective truth now that, from his perspective, that God doesn't exist, that we've shown that God doesn't exist. I think that kind of set the stage for 20th century postmodernism to really kind of say, well, actually, since God isn't around to kind of guarantee our access to the real world, to the objective truth about reality, we're kind of left up to our own devices. We're kind of left to kind of making up meaning on our own, making up moral truths on our own, all that kind of thing, right? So I think that is that historical progression, right? That modernism itself, some of the biggest thinkers in modernism kind of planted the seeds for what would blossom in the 20th century as postmodernism, as this rejection of this ability to know objective truth.
What was the effect of World War One on this optimism? That's sort of seen as one of the major turns in worldview.
Yeah, I mean, I think both World War One and World War Two, right? Because
Yeah.
I think that maybe after World War One, they thought, okay, we're gonna stop this, this totalitarianism, we're gonna stop this tyranny, and we're gonna stop this senseless slaughter of millions of people. But then it's like World War Two comes around, and it's like even worse, right? So I think that kind of Nietzsche sets this frame in terms of like, okay, there are kind of like no moorings anymore, right? Because we've kind of disconnected ourselves from God. But I think that those at the cultural level, at the sociological level, really kind of shattered this idea that human reason was enough to provide stability and peace and prosperity and things like that, right? If anything, human reason seems to be really good at making really powerful weapons, like mustard gas and chemical warfare in World War One, and in World War Two you have the atomic bomb, right? And so I think that in some sense, this is why I think the second half of the 20th century is when postmodernism really kind of grew and bore the fruit that it has, because it's like looking back at both the philosophical events of the 1800s, but then also like how those events led to the disasters of the first half of the 20th century. I think that really played a huge role in kind of moving the average person to kind of really have skeptical worries about whether reason could actually do the things that the modern philosophers thought it could, right? That it could solve all of our problems and could give us all the objective truths that we want. And then they said, well, we have no one else to turn to, right? Because, Nietzsche said God is dead. And so therefore, we're, again, like we have to abandon the hope of having any kind of objective truth that reason can actually accomplish these things.
Yeah. Another thing that you commonly hear is that postmodernism really took hold in the 1960s. And this is what I've heard from lots and lots of people. What happened in the 60s that made it such that it's viewed as the beginning of postmodernism?
I think that in the 60s, I mean, as well as in the 50s. And the 50s is when a lot of intellectuals were really thinking through, the aftermath of World War II, right? You look at Auschwitz and you look at the atomic bomb over Hiroshima and all those kinds of things, and thinking about the horrors of what we had just witnessed during that time. And it was during that time they were really kind of reevaluating, like, what are we as human beings? Like, what are we capable of? Like, what's possible for reason? And then it's that time where I think they started writing books and writing essays, this kind of thing. I think at the same time you had this movement called existentialism that was going on, which is almost like it's a close cousin of postmodernism in the sense that like folks like Sartre would like say things like we have to make up our own values because there are no kind of values outside of us in the objective world. We have to make up our own meaning, right? And kind of picking up the baton from Nietzsche in that regard. And I think that together with like reflection on what was going on in World War One and Two, that kind of led to the environment of the 60s. And of course, there's also the whole counterculture movement in the 1960s that kind of, in a way, I think, responding to a lot of that reflection on World War II and existentialism, basically said, we're not going to do things the traditional way. We're going to overturn things, right, in terms of sexual ethics, in terms of how we do politics, in terms of all these kinds of things, right? So I think that these cultural forces as well as these kind of intellectual forces kind of came together in the 1960s to kind of overturn everything that was thought to be stable in terms of like the modern era's thinking and culture.
Mm-hmm. So who were the major postmodern thinkers? You mentioned Derrida. Who were a couple of the others?
Yeah, so I think another major figure is Michel Foucault, who is I mean, a lot of these major postmodernists were French thinkers, literary theorists, as well as I mean, in France there's this long tradition of folks who are kind of in the humanities, right? That they do some philosophy, they do some literature, they do some literary theory, that kind of thing. So Foucault was another major French postmodernist, and he really kind of, he specifically kind of took up the baton from Nietzsche, right? And he said, look, kind of extending Nietzsche's kind of vision into the 20th century in terms of like there is no God, and so therefore we are kind of left to our own devices. Like we're the ones who construct reality in a real way, and even and so like one of his major works is in the area of sexuality, right? And you actually see this, now like a couple decades later, in which he said, even our sexuality is something that we construct, it's something that we create, and so it's not something that is kind of like out there objectively, but it's something that we create both as individuals and as a culture. And that kind of thing. So you can kind of see how today's like huge battles in terms of what counts as marriage, what counts as gender identity, all these kind of things are rooted in this kind of postmodern, the application of these postmodern ideas to these different areas in terms of culture, society, gender, sexuality, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So how should we as Christians react to all this? What is the or I guess sort of contrast the postmodern view with the Christian view?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that this is kind of it's very interesting, because I think that I have a lecture that I give at George Fox every so often about this, and I think that the Christian worldview is kind of caught in between modernism and postmodernism, right? In the sense that like it agrees with certain elements of both, but disagrees with both in different areas, right? So like, with regard to postmodernism, like the Christian worldview says, no, there's actually is objective truth, right? There is truth about reality. There's truth about us. There is truth about that there is a God and all these kinds of things. And that not only is there this truth, but that God has made us in such a way and given us grace that we actually can know some of that objective truth, right? And so I think that there's this kind of there's this thing, postmodernism, like you're going too far in that kind of skepticism and relativism and rejection of objective truth. But I think that at the same time, it's also, the Christian perspective has to also be critiquing and correcting modernism, right? Because modernism was that view in which reason is, there's this word called omnicompetent, right? That's able to do everything, right? And do everything successfully and bring about, peace and technology and advancement. I mean, there continue to be, even in today's society, many folks who are modernists in their perspective, right? Folks like Elon Musk, folks like the late Stephen Hawking, physicist, who really are very optimistic with regard to what we can do as human beings with our reason, right? And I think the Christian worldview is going to side with the postmodernists in kind of critiquing the modernist worldview and says, yes, God has given us the ability to reason and to have access to some objective truth, but that this reason that we have is not perfect. In fact, if anything, Christian theologians and philosophers would say that our human reason suffers from what they call the noetic effects of sin. The noetic effects of sins being like the effects of sins on our mind, right? That our mind, because of sin, is twisted and broken and fallen. And so this kind of excessive optimism about what we can accomplish as human beings using reason alone is something that is too much in that direction, right? So like I like to give like that postmodernism and modernism are kind of at the ends of a spectrum, that they're kind of at these extremes, and that they exhibit these intellectual vices, right? Postmodernism has this vice of like skepticism, like way too much skepticism, saying, we can't know anything, there's no objective truth, blah, blah, blah. And the other, equal and opposite intellectual vice for modernism is this excessive confidence and this overconfidence, right? That we can accomplish everything with regard to using our reason. And I think the Christian worldview says, we actually have to kind of strike the right balance in the middle, right? If you know anything about Aristotle, right? Aristotle's ethics is all about like, finding the mean between two extremes. And I think that this kind of model fits really well with regard to this question, in which Christianity says we do have access to objective truth, but at the same time, we can't expect our reason to be omnicompetent, that we can't accomplish everything using our reason. We need grace. We need revelation, all these kinds of things to kind of supplement the ways in which our reason has fallen, reason has been broken. So I think that that's kind of the needle that needs to be threaded, right? In the sense that like we can't go to one extreme or the other, whether it be postmodernism or modernism. And it's always finding that right balance that's the more challenging, task, as opposed to like, the easy kind of extremes that we might gravitate toward.
Yeah. So what do you think? Okay, so I've heard a couple different views on this. So do you think where we are right now, or are we still within postmodernism, or do you think we're moving into something else, or are we on the cusp of something else? What are your thoughts on
No,
that?
I think we're still. I mean, in academia, postmodernism isn't a brand new thing. I think postmodernism was really kind of in its heyday, in its strongest times in the 80s and 90s, and I think that there's still quite a bit of influence now, but I don't think it's growing in academia. I think there's lots of folks in academia who push back against it, like especially folks in science and engineering and those kind of fields. They're like, no, we can't. We're not going to go there. That's so like for example, in the 1990s, there was what's called the science wars that was going on, among intellectuals, where these postmodernists were saying, science doesn't give us anything about objective reality, and then all these scientists and advocates of science would push back and say, no, actually, science is like the most objective thing that we can do, right? And so there was this like constant battle between these two camps in the 1990s. I think that battle has kind of like cooled down a little bit. I mean, not that anyone has changed their minds about it, but it's not something as as strongly argued now as it was then. So I think those camps are still there. It's just that it's the debate is kind of like passé now. But I think in the overall culture, I think that postmodernism is very much ascendant, right, in that regard, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, where sometimes we said in the political arena that this is a post-truth era, right? Notice that too is a postmodern kind of conception, right? It's like if truth doesn't matter anymore in politics, like you can say whatever you want and make kind of outlandish claims both on the left and right, even though you yourself know that that's not, quote, true, just to score political points, just to rile up your base, whatever it might be. Like I think that shows that like postmodernism has really infected even the political arena. Not that that kind of relativism and cynicism wasn't there before, but even more so, that it's just out in the open now, right? And I think that lots of people in their everyday life really do think of most things from a postmodern perspective. They'll be like, it's like, that's true for you, that's not true for me, right? This kind of idea, that kind of easy relativism. It's like, oh, you do you, I'll do me. It's like there's no real truth as to whether or not this or that is wrong or the right thing, that kind of thing. So I think that there is I think that that's something that is deeply ingrained in the culture now. And I think that that's something that it's almost like this reflexive kind of postmodernism that even children learn from a very early age. I'm thinking of even like some students who come to George Fox, many of whom who are Christian, and yet like when I grade their essays in philosophy or ethics, some of them are just like, well, of course there's no objective truth. I'm like, wait, like you grew up in a Christian family and you maybe even went to a Christian school or were homeschooled, and yet you've somehow absorbed this philosophy from the culture. It's so pervasive, right?
Yeah.
But I think at the same time, I think that there's this kind of, I think people know deep down that it can't be true, right? Postmodernism can't be true because, vast majority of people, even those people say, you do you, I'll do me, all that kind of stuff. What's true for you is not true for me. When they get sick or when they have cancer or something like that, they're not going to think there's no objective truth. They're actually going to go to the doctor and say, what's the best treatment? What's the best, that kind of thing. And so so I think deep down people know that they can't live a life consistently that rejects objective truth. I think deep down they know that they really do believe that there is objective truth. It's just that in certain areas of the life, it's easier or more convenient to claim that there isn't objective truth, maybe in the realms of morality or in the realms of politics or religion, or maybe their life is not necessarily on the line there, right? But when their life is on the line or when the big things, matter, right? They're going to be like, I want to know what's really true, right? Not just like subjectively true, that kind of thing. So I think that is kind of a hopeful thing that, that society hasn't completely gone over to the side of postmodernism. That there's this kind of recognition that a fully postmodern life is not something that you can actually live.
Yeah. So what then is the way forward? How do we find that mean between two extremes?
Well, I mean, I think that that's something that there's a couple different things there. One is just the first stage would be to realize that this is what's going on. I think a lot of people in our society, they have this knee-jerk relativism or this knee-jerk postmodernism, but they haven't really thought through what truth means. Like, they haven't really thought through like what belief means and what's the difference between believing and truth is, right? And so, I mean, this is where it's like, for me as an educator, I really want to teach my students, like, here are some basic things. What does truth mean? What does belief mean? Like, here are these different claims about postmodernism and modernism. Like, why should we accept this view versus that view? What are the arguments for and against it? And obviously I have like whole lectures on that kind of thing. But I do think that just basic understanding of what truth means and what different rival definitions of truth could be, right? I think that could clear things up tremendously for people. But it's just that very few people are ever educated in that, right? I think even in many high schools, they don't really think through that very carefully. And so, like, I feel like as a college professor, I have to do a lot of deprogramming when students come in and say, okay, you're really confused here, right? You're using belief as a synonym for truth, but they're not the same, because if they are the same, then you couldn't have false beliefs, right? But we all think that some people have false beliefs, and so therefore they can't be the same thing, right? And it's like students, when they hear that, they're like, I guess you're right. But they've never given thought to that, this question. So I think that we need to have basic kind of, philosophical understanding about these things so that we are using our terms correctly, right? So I think that that's one thing, the educational kind of thing. But I do think that in terms of the Christian kind of finding the right balance between these two extremes, I think that that's something that requires great humility, right? Because I think that there's that tendency to kind of go to extremes, whether it be in the moral realm or the intellectual realm, in which it's just easier to say we don't know anything, or it's just easier to say, we can know everything through reason. It's much harder actually to say, I have to be humble, but I also have to not be too kind of skeptical either, right? So there's this balance that needs to be struck, and I think that that's something that requires humility and also requires prayer. It's like, God, guide our thoughts, guide the way that we think and the way that we think about our own thinking, right? To have that right degree of confidence, right? That you have a degree of confidence, but you also have a degree of humility, and striking that balance, I think it requires like God's help, right? In terms of like, what can we be relatively confident about, but not overly dogmatic either, right? So I think that that's something that requires like personal growth, also requires prayer and the assistance of God's Holy Spirit, right, in that regard. So I think that there's this philosophical educational type element that we need to do, both with regard to students as well as the overall culture. But then there's also this kind of intellectual virtue that needs to be developed in us over time by careful thought and prayer, and hopefully with God's assistance and grace.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you for your time.
Oh, you're
Really
very
appreciate
welcome.
it.